Some secrets are meant to protect us. Others imprison us for a lifetime. When Margaret Chen opened the bottom drawer of her grandmother's antique dresser, she expected to find old linens and forgotten keepsakes. Instead, she discovered a locked rosewood box containing letters addressed to someone named Rose, a birth certificate that didn't match the family story she'd grown up with, and a photograph of her grandmother with a stranger. In that single moment, 73 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble, revealing a love story that was never supposed to be told, a child who was never supposed to exist, and a family separated by secrets that span generations. What Margaret uncovered would force her grandmother to confront a past she thought was buried forever. It would lead to a reunion that seemed impossible and revelations that would shatter everything this family believed about who they were. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some truths, no matter how painful, deserve to finally see the light. If you want to discover how this incredible true story unfolds, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. This is a journey you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun filtered through the yellowed lace curtains of the old Victorian house, casting intricate shadows across the dusty hardwood floors. Margaret Chen stood in what had been her grandmother's bedroom for the last 40 years, surrounded by a lifetime of accumulated memories packed into cardboard boxes and faded photograph albums. At 73, her grandmother Dorothy had finally agreed to move into an assisted living facility, and the task of clearing out the family home had fallen to Margaret. She had been at it for hours, sorting through clothes that smelled of lavender and mothballs, ancient cookbooks with handwritten notes in the margins, and enough knickknacks to fill an antique store. But it was the massive mahogany dresser that stood against the far wall that drew her attention now. She had saved it for last, knowing it held her grandmother's most personal belongings. The top drawers revealed nothing unexpected: silk scarves, pearl necklaces, old makeup compacts. But when Margaret pulled open the bottom drawer, she felt resistance. Something was stuck. She pulled harder, and the drawer finally gave way with a reluctant groan. Behind a stack of yellowed linens, her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. A box. Margaret's heart quickened as she extracted it, a rosewood jewelry box she had never seen before, its surface covered in intricate carved roses. It was locked. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the collection of keys in a small dish on the nightstand. After trying several, one finally turned with a soft click. Inside, there were no jewels. Instead, she found a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon, their envelopes addressed in an elegant, masculine hand. But it was what lay beneath them that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat: a birth certificate. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper. The name on the certificate was Dorothy May Sullivan, her grandmother's maiden name. Date of birth, April 15, 1952. But it was the section labeled "Father" that made Margaret's world tilt on its axis. The name written there was not her great-grandfather's name, the man whose photograph had sat on the mantelpiece her entire life, the man her grandmother had always spoken of with quiet reverence. Instead, it read, "Father, unknown." Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed, the certificate clutched in her shaking hands. How was this possible? Her grandmother had always told stories about her father, about how he had worked in the steel mills, how he had died in an accident when Dorothy was just a baby. The family history Margaret had grown up with suddenly felt like a house of cards collapsing around her. She reached for the letters, her hands moving almost of their own accord. The first one was dated June 1951, postmarked from Boston. She carefully extracted the aged paper and began to read. "My dearest Rose," it began, and Margaret's confusion deepened. Rose? Her grandmother's name was Dorothy. She continued reading, her eyes flying over words of passionate love, of promises to return, of a future together. The letter was signed only with the initial, J. Margaret read letter after letter, each one revealing more of a story she had never known existed. Her grandmother, or someone, had been involved in a love affair, one that had apparently produced a child. But who was Rose? And who was Jay? As she reached the bottom of the stack, she found a photograph tucked into the last envelope. It showed a young woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, standing next to a handsome man in a military uniform. On the back, written in faded pencil, were the words, Rose and James, Boston Harbor, May 1951. Margaret's mind raced. If her grandmother's birth certificate listed her father as unknown, and these letters and photographs suggested a secret relationship, what did it all mean? Had her grandmother been protecting someone? Had she been protecting herself? She thought about her mother, Dorothy's daughter, who had passed away 5 years ago from cancer. Had she known about this? Margaret's father had died when she was young, and her mother had rarely spoken about the family's history. Now Margaret wondered if that silence had been intentional. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted her back to the present. Through the window, she saw her cousin Rachel approaching the house. Rachel, whose mother was Dorothy's younger sister, Aunt Helen. If anyone might know something about this mystery, it would be Aunt Helen. Margaret quickly gathered the letters, the birth certificate, and the photograph, tucking them carefully into her purse. Something told her she needed to understand this secret before sharing it with anyone else. The family history she had always known was built on a foundation that was apparently false. And now she had to decide whether to keep digging or to let the past remain buried. As Rachel's footsteps sounded on the front porch, Margaret closed the drawer and stood up, smoothing her hands over her jeans. Her heart was still pounding, her mind spinning with questions. Who was her grandmother really? What secrets had she carried for over 7 decades? And most importantly, what would Margaret discover if she followed this trail of hidden truths? She took a deep breath and went to answer the door, the weight of the rosewood box's contents heavy in her purse and heavier still on her conscience. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. And Margaret had just stepped through one into a past she never knew existed. Margaret barely slept that night. The letters lay spread across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve, each one revealing fragments of a love story that shouldn't exist according to everything she knew about her family. The birth certificate sat beside them, its stark declaration of father, unknown, seeming to mock the official family narrative she had believed her entire life. At 7 in the morning, she found herself parked outside Meadowbrook Assisted Living, a thermos of coffee growing cold in her cup holder. She had called ahead, telling the staff she would be visiting her grandmother early. What she hadn't told them was that she was coming armed with questions that might shatter an old woman's carefully constructed world. The hallways of Meadowbrook smelled of antiseptic and cafeteria breakfast, a combination that always made Margaret's stomach turn slightly. She passed residents in wheelchairs, some alert and greeting her cheerfully, others lost in their own private worlds. Room 217 was at the end of the hall, and through the half-open door, she could see her grandmother sitting in her favorite armchair, the one Margaret had helped move from the old house just 2 weeks ago. "Grammy?" Margaret knocked softly, pushing the door open wider. Dorothy looked up from the book in her lap, her face brightening with genuine delight. At 73, she was still remarkably sharp, her blue eyes clear and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she had worn for as long as Margaret could remember. "Margaret! What a wonderful surprise. I wasn't expecting you until this weekend." Margaret stepped inside, closing the door behind her with more force than she intended. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the small room. She pulled a chair close to her grandmother's and sat down, her hands gripping the strap of her purse where the letters and documents lay hidden. "I was at the house yesterday," Margaret began, her voice careful and measured. "Finishing up the last of the packing." "Oh, that old place," Dorothy sighed, setting her book aside. "I know it needs to be done, dear, but it's hard letting go of a home where I raised my family, where every room holds a memory." "Yes, memories," Margaret echoed, her throat tight. "I found something interesting in your bedroom. In the bottom drawer of your dresser." She watched her grandmother's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition, any flicker of concern. For a moment, Dorothy's expression remained placid, curious. Then something shifted. The color drained from her cheeks, and her hand moved involuntarily to her throat, fingers touching the pearl she always wore. "The bottom drawer," Dorothy repeated, her voice suddenly small and distant. Margaret pulled the rosewood box from her purse and set it on the small table between them. The morning light streaming through the window caught the carved roses on its surface, making them seem almost alive. Dorothy stared at it as if it were a ghost materialized before her eyes. "I found the letters, Grammy. And the birth certificate. And the photograph of you with a man named James." Margaret's voice cracked slightly on the name. "A man who wasn't the grandfather I thought I knew." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity. Dorothy's hands began to tremble in her lap, and she clasped them together tightly, her knuckles turning white. When she finally looked up at Margaret, there were tears pooling in her eyes, threatening to spill over onto her lined cheeks. "I never wanted you to know," Dorothy whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted anyone to know. That part of my life, it was supposed to be buried with me." Margaret felt her own eyes burning with tears. "But Grammy, I don't understand. Who was Rose? The letters are addressed to Rose, but you're Dorothy. And who was James? And why does your birth certificate say your father was unknown when you always told us about him working in the steel mills?" Dorothy reached for the box with shaking hands, opening it slowly as if handling something sacred and dangerous all at once. She extracted one of the letters, holding it against her chest like a talisman. "Rose was my name," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "My real name. Dorothy came later." "What do you mean, later?" The old woman took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 7 decades of secrets. "I wasn't born Dorothy Mae Sullivan. I was born Rose Elizabeth Montgomery. My mother gave me up when I was 3 days old. She was only 17, unmarried, and from a prominent family in Boston. Having an illegitimate child would have destroyed her reputation and her family's standing in society." Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her chair. "You were adopted?" "Not officially. Not in any legal sense that would leave a paper trail." Dorothy's tears were flowing freely now, carving paths down her weathered cheeks. "My mother's sister, Catherine Sullivan, couldn't have children of her own. She and her husband took me in, raised me as their daughter. They changed my name, moved from Boston to Pittsburgh, and created a new life for all of us. The story about my father dying in the steel mills, that was the story they told to explain why there was no father around. Catherine's husband had actually died years before I came into their lives." "So the man in the photograph," Margaret said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "James. He was your biological father?" Dorothy nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "He was a soldier, about to be deployed to Korea. My mother, my birth mother, was Rose Elizabeth Montgomery, daughter of one of Boston's wealthiest shipping magnates. James was the son of their Irish housemaid. It was impossible. Their love was impossible in that world, in that time." Margaret reached across and took her grandmother's hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was. "What happened to him? To James?" "He died in Korea in 1952. He never knew about me. My birth mother, Sarah, she found out she was pregnant after he had already shipped out. By the time she could have told him, he was gone." Dorothy's voice broke completely. "She kept those letters her entire life. When she died 10 years ago, her lawyer tracked me down and gave me the box. That's when I learned the whole truth. That's when I discovered that the man who wrote those beautiful words, who loved my mother so completely, was my father. And he never knew I existed." The weight of the revelation pressed down on Margaret like a physical force. Her grandmother, this woman she thought she knew, had carried this secret for her entire life. She had been born from a forbidden love, given away to protect a family's reputation, raised under a false identity, and then decades later discovered the truth about her origins from beyond the grave. "Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret asked gently. Why keep it secret even after you knew? Dorothy looked out the window at the gardens beyond, her eyes distant and sad. What good would it have done? My adoptive parents, Catherine and John Sullivan, they were the ones who raised me, who loved me, who gave me a life. They're the ones I called mother and father. And your mother, my daughter, she grew up with a certain understanding of who she was, where she came from. I didn't want to burden her with the knowledge that her entire family history was built on lies and secrets. She turned back to Margaret, her eyes pleading. Can you understand that? Sometimes keeping secrets is an act of love. Margaret squeezed her grandmother's hand tighter, her own tears flowing now. I understand, Grammy. Or at least, I'm trying to. Margaret spent the next 3 days in a state of restless obsession. She had taken time off from her job at the university library, telling her supervisor she had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue. The revelation about her grandmother's origins had opened a door to a past that demanded exploration, and Margaret found herself unable to think about anything else. She had transformed her dining room into a makeshift research center. The letters from the rosewood box were carefully arranged in chronological order, each one read and reread until she had practically memorized them. Her laptop sat open to multiple tabs, ancestry websites, historical records, Korean War casualty databases. Yellow legal pads covered in notes and questions surrounded her like a fortress of incomplete information. The photograph of Rose and James had been scanned and enlarged, printed out so she could study every detail. James had been handsome in a classic way, with dark hair and strong features, his military uniform pressed and pristine. Rose, her grandmother, had been breathtakingly beautiful at 17, with luminous eyes that seemed to hold both joy and sadness simultaneously. They stood close together but not touching, aware even then that their love existed in a world that wouldn't accept it. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her husband, David. Coming home soon. Dinner? She glanced at the clock, surprised to see it was already 7 in the evening. She had been at this for 12 straight hours, barely stopping to eat or rest. Order takeout, she typed back. Still working on family research. Love you. She returned her attention to the laptop screen, where she had finally found something promising. The Korean War casualty database had hundreds of soldiers named James, but she had been filtering by date of death and unit information gleaned from the letters. One entry made her pulse quicken. James Patrick O'Connor, Private First Class, died August 3, 1952, in combat operations near the 38th parallel. The dates matched. The letters mentioned that James had been assigned to an infantry unit, which aligned with this record. Margaret clicked through to request his service records, knowing it would take weeks for the National Archives to process her request, but feeling that she was finally making progress toward understanding the full story. But it was what she found next that truly changed everything. While searching through Boston newspaper archives from 1951, she discovered an engagement announcement that made her breath catch in her throat. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Montgomery of Beacon Hill are pleased to announce the engagement of their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, to Mr. William Harrison Thornton III of the Thornton banking family. A June wedding is planned. The announcement was dated September 1951, 4 months after the photograph of Rose and James had been taken, and approximately 3 months after Sarah would have discovered she was pregnant with Rose. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing through the implications. Sarah Montgomery had been engaged to someone else, forced into a marriage with a suitable man from her own social class while carrying the child of her Irish housemaid's son. The cruelty of it, the absolute heartbreak, made Margaret's chest ache with sympathetic pain for a woman she had never known. She searched for more information about Sarah Montgomery Thornton and found surprisingly little. A few society page mentions of charitable events, a brief obituary from 15 years ago that mentioned she had passed away peacefully at her home in Boston, survived by her husband William and 2 sons, Robert and Charles Thornton. Margaret felt a jolt of realization. Her grandmother had half-brothers, men who had no idea they had a sister born before their parents' marriage. Did they know about Rose? Had Sarah ever told her husband about the child she gave away? Or had she carried that secret to her grave, leaving only the letters as proof that James and their daughter had ever existed? The sound of the front door opening pulled Margaret from her thoughts. David appeared in the doorway of the dining room, still in his work clothes, carrying bags of Chinese food. His expression shifted from concern to something closer to alarm as he took in the scene, his wife surrounded by papers and photographs, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, still wearing the same clothes she had worn yesterday. "Maggie," he said gently, using the nickname only he called her. "You need to take a break. You've been at this non-stop since you found those letters." "I can't stop, David. Don't you understand? My entire family history is different from what I thought. My grandmother is different from who I thought she was. And there are people out there, Sarah's sons, my grandmother's half-brothers, who might have answers to questions I don't even know how to ask yet." David set the food down and came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "What are you going to do? Are you planning to contact these men?" Margaret hadn't allowed herself to fully consider that question until now. Robert and Charles Thornton, they would be in their 60s now, probably with families of their own, lives built on their own understanding of their family history. What right did she have to disrupt that with revelations about a half-sister their mother had given away before they were born? "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "Part of me wants to know everything, to understand the complete picture. But another part of me thinks maybe Grammy was right. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried." "What does your gut tell you?" David asked, his hands kneading the tension from her shoulders. Margaret looked down at the photograph of Rose and James, at the love captured in a moment before everything fell apart. She thought about her grandmother, carrying the weight of not knowing her true origins for most of her life, then carrying the weight of knowing for the last 10 years. She thought about Sarah Montgomery, giving up her child to preserve her family's reputation, then living a life with a man she presumably didn't love, raising children while always knowing about the daughter she had abandoned. "My gut tells me that the truth matters," Margaret said finally. "That these stories, these lives, they shouldn't just disappear as if they never happened. James died without knowing he had a daughter. Sarah died without her sons knowing they had a sister. Grammy lived most of her life not knowing who she really was. All of that matters. All of that deserves to be acknowledged." David was quiet for a moment, then he squeezed her shoulders gently. "Then maybe you should talk to your grandmother again. Ask her what she wants. This is her story, after all. Maybe she has thoughts about whether or not to contact the Thorntons." Margaret nodded slowly, knowing he was right. This wasn't just about satisfying her own curiosity or her own need to understand the past. This was about respecting her grandmother's agency over her own story, even at this late stage of her life. "I'll go see her tomorrow," Margaret said, finally turning away from the laptop screen. "And this time, I'll ask her what she wants, not just what I think should happen." That night, Margaret dreamed of a young woman standing at a harbor, watching a ship carry away the man she loved, knowing she carried his child and would never see him again. In the dream, the woman's face shifted between Sarah's features from the old photographs and Margaret's own reflection, as if the pain of that loss transcended generations, connecting them all in a web of secrets and sorrow and love that had nowhere to go but into hidden boxes and forgotten letters. Margaret arrived at Meadowbrook just after breakfast, carrying a folder with all the research she had compiled over the past 3 days. The morning was crisp and clear, autumn leaves swirling across the parking lot in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, the facility had a different energy than her previous visit. Residents were more active, some doing chair exercises in the common room, others playing cards or working on puzzles. She found her grandmother in the sunroom, a bright space filled with plants and comfortable seating where residents could enjoy the morning light. Dorothy sat alone by the window, a cup of tea growing cold on the small table beside her. She seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than she had just days before, as if the weight of revealed secrets had physically diminished her. "Grammy," Margaret said softly, not wanting to startle her. Dorothy turned, and Margaret saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, as though she had been crying. "I knew you would come back," the old woman said. "I've been thinking about nothing else since you left. About what to do now that you know. About what it all means." Margaret pulled a chair close and sat down, setting the folder on her lap. "I've been doing some research. I found information about James Patrick O'Connor. He died in Korea in 1952, just like the letter suggested. And I found information about your birth mother, Sarah Montgomery. She married a man named William Thornton in 1951. Dorothy's hand moved to her throat again, that gesture Margaret now recognized as a sign of deep emotion. "She married him," Dorothy whispered. "Even though she loved James. She had to, Grammy. Her family would have insisted. And she was pregnant with you, she needed to protect you, to give you a chance at a life, even if she couldn't raise you herself." Tears began to slip down Dorothy's cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away. "I've spent 10 years thinking about her, wondering what kind of woman she was, whether she thought about me, whether she regretted giving me away. When that lawyer came with the box, with the letters and the photograph, it was like opening Pandora's box. Suddenly, I had to reconcile the mother who raised me, Catherine Sullivan, with this other mother who gave me life but couldn't keep me." Margaret reached out and took her grandmother's hand, feeling the papery texture of her skin, the bones so delicate beneath. "I found something else," she said gently. "Sarah had 2 sons with William Thornton. Robert and Charles. They would be your half-brothers. They're still alive, living in Boston." The effect of this news on Dorothy was immediate and profound. Her entire body seemed to go rigid, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. For a moment, Margaret worried she might be having some kind of medical episode, but then Dorothy spoke, her voice emerging in a broken whisper. "Brothers," she said. "I have brothers. After all these years of being an only child, of raising my own daughter alone after her father died, of feeling like I was the last of my line, I have brothers. The question is," Margaret said carefully, "what do you want to do about it? Do you want to contact them? Do you want them to know you exist?" Dorothy pulled her hand away and stood up, moving to the window with surprising energy. She pressed her palm against the glass, staring out at the garden where a few late-blooming roses still clung to their bushes. Margaret waited, giving her grandmother the space to process this information, to make sense of feelings that must be impossibly complex. "Tell me about them," Dorothy said finally, not turning around. "What did you find out about my brothers?" Margaret opened her folder and pulled out the printouts she had made. "Robert is 68. He's a retired professor of history at Boston University. He's married, has 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He published a book about Boston's shipping industry in the 19th century, your biological grandfather's family business." Dorothy's shoulders shook slightly, and Margaret realized she was crying again. "He wrote about his own grandfather without knowing that I existed. That I'm part of that history too. Charles is 65, Margaret continued. He's a physician, a cardiologist. He runs a practice in Boston and does volunteer work at a free clinic in Roxbury. He's been married twice, has 2 children from his first marriage." She paused, then added, "I found an interview he gave a few years ago about his work. He talked about his mother, about how she inspired his commitment to helping underserved communities. He said she had a deep sense of compassion and a sadness in her eyes that he never fully understood." At this, Dorothy turned around, her face streaked with tears but her expression somehow both devastated and hopeful. "She thought about me. If there was sadness in her eyes that her son could see, she must have thought about me. About the daughter she gave away. I think she thought about you every day of her life," Margaret said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I think giving you up was probably the hardest thing she ever did, and I think she carried that pain with her always." Dorothy returned to her chair, sinking into it as if exhausted by the weight of everything she was learning. She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant. Margaret sat with her in that silence, understanding that some moments required no words, that her grandmother was processing decades of loneliness and longing, of questions that now had answers but also raised new questions about what to do with those answers. "I'm 73 years old," Dorothy said eventually. "I've lived my entire life without knowing these men existed. They've lived their entire lives without knowing I existed. Is it fair to disrupt their lives now? To burden them with the knowledge that their mother gave away a child before they were born? Is it fair to deny them the truth?" Margaret countered gently. "Is it fair to deny yourself the possibility of knowing your brothers, of connecting with the only living link you have to your birth parents? What if they don't want to know me? What if they're angry that their mother kept this secret? What if they feel betrayed or confused or," Dorothy's voice broke. "What if they reject me?" Margaret moved her chair even closer, putting her arm around her grandmother's shoulders. "Then at least you'll know. And you'll know that you tried. But Grammy, what if they welcome you? What if they've always felt that something was missing from their family story, and you're the missing piece? What if they want to know their sister?" Dorothy leaned into Margaret's embrace, and for a moment, the roles felt reversed, Margaret comforting her grandmother the way Dorothy had comforted her so many times throughout her childhood. They sat like that for a long time, grandmother and granddaughter, connected by blood and love and now by this shared secret that had the power to either divide or unite a fractured family. "I'm scared," Dorothy finally admitted. "I'm an old woman, and I'm scared like a child." "Being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do it," Margaret said. "Sometimes the things that scare us most are the things we need to do to heal." Dorothy pulled back and looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and something shifted in her expression. A determination seemed to settle over her features, replacing the fear with a quiet resolve. "You're right. Sarah gave me life, and then she let me go to give me a chance at a better life. The least I can do is honor that sacrifice by living fully, by embracing the truth of who I am, even at this late stage." "So you want to contact them?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. Dorothy nodded slowly. "Yes. Yes, I do. I want to know my brothers. I want them to know they had a sister. And I want to tell them about their mother, about the woman who loved a soldier named James O'Connor and had the courage to protect the child that love created, even though it broke her heart." The next 2 weeks were a blur of careful planning and second-guessing. Margaret and Dorothy spent hours together crafting the perfect letter, one that would reveal the truth without causing unnecessary shock, that would explain the circumstances without placing blame, that would extend an invitation without demanding a response. They went through 17 drafts. Dorothy would write something, then Margaret would read it and suggest changes. They would revise, read it again, and Dorothy would decide it wasn't right. The wastebasket in Margaret's home office filled with crumpled attempts, each one representing a different approach to an impossible task. How do you tell someone that their entire understanding of their family history is incomplete? It was David who finally helped them break through the paralysis. He came home one evening to find both women staring at yet another draft, their faces etched with frustration and anxiety. He read the letter, set it down, and said simply, "Stop trying to make it perfect. Just make it true." That night, Dorothy wrote from her heart, not her head. She wrote about being born Rose Elizabeth Montgomery, about learning the truth only 10 years ago, about the letters and the photograph and the love story that created her. She wrote about her life as Dorothy Sullivan, about the parents who raised her with love despite not being her biological parents, about her own daughter and granddaughter. And she wrote about wanting to know her brothers, if they were willing to know her. Margaret typed up the final version on her laptop, printed it on good stationery, and brought it to Meadowbrook for Dorothy to sign. Her grandmother's hand shook as she held the pen, and Margaret watched as Dorothy carefully wrote her signature, Dorothy May Sullivan, Rose Elizabeth Montgomery. The dual names seemed to capture everything, the life lived and the life that might have been. They decided to send the letter to Robert first, the older brother, the historian who might appreciate the complexity of uncovering hidden family narratives. Margaret had found his email address through the Boston University website, but Dorothy insisted on a physical letter. This deserves paper and ink, she had said. This deserves the weight of something real that he can hold in his hands. Margaret mailed the letter on a Thursday morning from the post office downtown. She had paid extra for certified mail with tracking, wanting to know exactly when it would arrive, when Robert Thornton would hold his mother's secret in his hands. The postal clerk had stamped it and tossed it into a bin with dozens of other letters, completely unaware that this particular envelope contained the power to reshape a family. The waiting was torture. Dorothy called Margaret every morning, asking if there had been any response. Margaret checked her email compulsively, even though they had provided Dorothy's room phone number as the primary contact. At night, Margaret lay awake imagining different scenarios, Robert reading the letter and crumpling it in anger, or reading it and weeping, or reading it and feeling nothing at all. 12 days after mailing the letter, Margaret's phone rang at 8:47 in the evening. The number had a Boston area code. Her heart lurched into her throat as she answered. "Hello. Is this Margaret Chin?" The voice was male, cultured, with the flat vowels of a New England accent. "Yes, this is Margaret. This is Robert Thornton. I received a letter." His voice broke slightly, and Margaret heard him take a shaky breath. "I received a letter from someone claiming to be my sister. My half-sister. A woman named Dorothy Sullivan." Margaret's hands were trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "Yes. My grandmother. She asked me to help her find you and your brother." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of Robert's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Is it true? All of it? My mother, she had a child before she married my father." "It's true," Margaret said gently. "Dorothy has the letters your mother kept, written by a soldier named James O'Connor. She has a birth certificate listing your mother as Rose Elizabeth Montgomery, with father unknown. And she has a photograph of your mother with James in 1951. Dear God." The words came out as barely a whisper. "My whole life, I thought I knew my mother. She was dignified, proper, always impeccably composed. But there was something sad about her, something wounded that I could never reach. I used to ask my father about it when I was young, and he would just say that some people carried private sorrows. I never imagined," he broke off, unable to continue. "Mr. Thornton, I know this must be overwhelming. Robert. Please, call me Robert." He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, he had regained some measure of composure. "I need to process this. I need to talk to my brother. Charles deserves to hear this from me, not from a phone call from a stranger. But I want to meet her. I want to meet Dorothy. My sister." He said the word as if testing its weight, its truth. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "She wants to meet you too. Very much. She's been so afraid that you would reject her, that you would be angry." "Angry?" Robert's voice cracked again. "I'm not angry. I don't even know what I am. Shocked, yes. Confused, certainly. But angry? No. If anything, I'm sad. Sad that my mother carried this pain alone for her entire life. Sad that somewhere out there, I had a sister I never knew existed. Sad for all the years we've missed." They talked for nearly an hour. Robert asked questions about Dorothy's life, about how she discovered the truth, about the letters and the photograph. Margaret answered as best she could, sometimes pulling up information from her research, sometimes just sharing stories about her grandmother. As they spoke, she could hear Robert's initial shock transforming into something else: curiosity, connection, perhaps even the beginning of familial love. "I want to bring Charles with me when we meet," Robert said as the conversation wound down. "He's going to be as stunned as I am, but he'll want to meet Dorothy too. We both will. How soon can we arrange this? I don't want to wait any longer than necessary. We've already lost 73 years. Margaret's throat was so tight she could barely speak. "I'll talk to Grammy and call you back tomorrow with some dates." Robert, thank you. Thank you for being willing to give her a chance. Thank you for helping her find us, he replied. Thank you for caring enough about family history to dig into the past. Some secrets need to be unearthed, no matter how painful they might be. After they hung up, Margaret sat in stunned silence for a long moment before calling Meadowbrook. The night nurse answered and transferred her to Dorothy's room, where her grandmother picked up on the first ring, as if she had been sitting by the phone. Margaret? Did he? He called, Grammy. Robert called. He wants to meet you. He and Charles both want to meet you. The sound that came through the phone was something between a sob and a laugh, pure emotion distilled into wordless sound. They want to meet me, Dorothy repeated, wonder in her voice. They want to know their sister. They do. Robert said they've already lost 73 years. He doesn't want to lose any more time. Margaret could hear her grandmother crying openly now, tears that carried decades of loneliness and longing, of wondering if she would ever truly belong to anyone, of hoping against hope that somewhere out there was family who might accept her. When? Dorothy asked through her tears. When can we meet? Soon, Grammy. Very soon. Robert is going to talk to Charles, and then we'll arrange everything. You're going to meet your brothers. That night, Margaret forwarded the news to David, who held her as she cried tears of relief and joy. She thought about all the forces that had to align for this moment to happen, the lawyer who tracked Dorothy down after Sarah's death, her own decision to clean out that bottom drawer, her persistence in researching the family history, Dorothy's courage to reach out despite her fear, and Robert's open heart that allowed him to embrace an impossible truth. Sometimes, Margaret thought, the most important thing you can do is refuse to let the past remain buried. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is shine light into dark corners where secrets have lived too long. And sometimes, family finds its way back together, even after decades of separation, even after a lifetime of not knowing, simply because someone is brave enough to ask, do you want to know the truth? The day of the meeting arrived with crystalline clarity, a Saturday in late October when the autumn colors were at their peak and the air carried the peculiar sharpness that heralds the coming winter. Margaret had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through every possible scenario of how this first meeting might unfold. Dorothy had called her at 6 a.m, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror. They had decided to meet at Margaret's house rather than Meadowbrook, wanting the encounter to feel more personal, more like a family gathering than an institutional visit. Margaret had spent the previous day cleaning obsessively, arranging flowers, preparing food that no one would probably eat because everyone would be too nervous. David had wisely made himself scarce, taking their daughter Emma to his mother's house for the day, understanding that this moment needed to belong to Dorothy and her brothers alone. Margaret picked up her grandmother at 10 a.m. Dorothy had dressed with meticulous care in a navy blue dress with pearl buttons, her silver hair freshly styled, her hands shaking so badly that Margaret had to help her with her coat. In the car, Dorothy clutched her purse in her lap, inside which Margaret knew she had placed the rosewood box with the letters, the photograph, and the birth certificate, all the evidence of a life that had been hidden for so long. What if they don't like me? Dorothy asked as they pulled into Margaret's driveway. It was the 5th time she had asked this question, and each time her voice carried the same vulnerable uncertainty. They're going to love you, Grammy, Margaret assured her, squeezing her grandmother's hand. How could they not? Robert and Charles were scheduled to arrive at 11. Margaret settled Dorothy in the living room's most comfortable chair, positioned near the window where the morning light was kind. She brought her grandmother tea that went untouched, and they waited in a silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock that had once belonged to Dorothy's adoptive mother, Catherine Sullivan. At precisely 11 o'clock, a car pulled up outside, a sleek silver sedan with Massachusetts plates. Margaret watched through the window as 2 men emerged, both tall, both wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that spoke of comfortable lives. They stood by the car for a moment, looking at the house, and Margaret could see them gathering courage just as Dorothy was inside. The older one, Robert, she assumed, had distinguished silver-gray hair and wore wire-rimmed glasses similar to Dorothy's. The younger one, Charles, had darker hair threaded with gray and the bearing of someone accustomed to command and confidence, though at this moment he looked anything but confident. They exchanged a few words Margaret couldn't hear, and then Robert squared his shoulders and they walked together toward the front door. Margaret opened it before they could knock. "Robert? Charles? I'm Margaret." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you for arranging this," Robert said, his voice the same cultured tone she remembered from their phone conversation, but now underlaid with barely controlled emotion. Is Dorothy here?" "She's in the living room. She's very nervous. She's been afraid you wouldn't come." Charles spoke for the first time, his voice deeper than his brother's, rougher around the edges. "We almost didn't. Not because we didn't want to, but because, how do you prepare for something like this? How do you prepare to meet a sister you never knew existed?" "You don't," Margaret said simply. "You just do it. Come in." She led them into the living room, and the moment when Dorothy first saw her brothers, and they first saw her, seemed to stretch into eternity. Dorothy rose from her chair, one hand pressed against her heart, her face a canvas of overwhelming emotion. Robert and Charles stopped in the doorway, staring at the woman who was their sister. It was Robert who moved first. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped in front of Dorothy, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made Margaret's chest ache. "You have her eyes," he whispered. "Our mother's eyes. I would know them anywhere." Dorothy's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I look like her. Truly." "Truly," Charles said, coming to stand beside his brother. He was the one crying now, tears flowing freely down his face without shame or attempt to hide them. "You look like photographs we have of her when she was young." Before, he broke off, unable to continue. "Before she had to give me away," Dorothy finished for him, her voice breaking on the words. And then, as if some invisible barrier had shattered, all 3 of them were embracing, an awkward, tearful tangle of arms and sobs and 73 years of separation trying to compress itself into a single moment of connection. Margaret stood back, her own tears flowing as she witnessed this reunion of people who shared blood and history but had never known each other until now. They stayed like that for a long time, holding onto each other as if afraid that letting go might break the spell, might prove this was all just a dream. When they finally separated, all 3 were crying openly, reaching for the tissues Margaret had wisely placed on every surface. "I'm sorry," Dorothy kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm apologizing for, but I feel I should apologize." "Don't," Robert said firmly, taking her hands in his. "Don't apologize for existing, for surviving, for finding us. If anyone should apologize, it should be us, for not knowing you were out there all these years, for not searching for you." "How could you search when you didn't know I existed?" Dorothy asked reasonably, wiping at her eyes with a tissue. Charles laughed, a sound that was half sob. "That's pragmatic. That's exactly how our mother thought. She was always the practical one, the rational one. Clearly, you inherited that from her." They moved to sit down, Robert and Charles on the sofa, Dorothy back in her chair, all of them leaning forward, unable to stop looking at each other, searching for similarities, for proof of shared genetics and shared history. Margaret brought coffee and the pastries she had bought, and this time people actually took them, needing something normal to do with their hands. "Tell us about your life," Robert said. "Everything. We want to know everything." And Dorothy did. She told them about growing up as Dorothy Sullivan in Pittsburgh, about the loving parents who raised her never knowing they weren't her biological family. She told them about marrying young, having a daughter, losing her husband to a heart attack when her daughter was just 10. She told them about working as a nurse for 40 years, about her granddaughter Margaret and great-granddaughter Emma. She told them about the normal, beautiful, ordinary life she had lived. Then she told them about the lawyer appearing 10 years ago with the rosewood box, about learning the truth of her origins, about reading the letters that revealed her parents' love story. Robert and Charles listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting with questions, their faces reflecting every emotion: sadness, wonder, anger at the circumstances that had separated their family, gratitude that Dorothy had found them. "She never told us," Charles said when Dorothy finished. "Our mother never breathed a word about having had a child before us. I thought I knew her, but clearly there was this entire part of her life, this enormous secret, that she carried alone." "She wasn't entirely alone," Dorothy said softly, reaching into her purse and pulling out the rosewood box. "She had these. She had the memory of James and the knowledge that somewhere out there, I existed." She opened the box and carefully extracted the photograph, holding it out to her brothers. "This is our mother with my father. Your mother with the man she loved before she married your father." Robert took the photograph with trembling hands, and Charles moved to look over his shoulder. Margaret watched their faces as they saw their mother as they had never seen her before, young, luminous with love, standing beside a handsome soldier who would die in a war without ever knowing he had created a daughter. "She's smiling," Robert said, his voice filled with wonder. "Really smiling. I don't think I ever saw her smile like that in my entire life." The afternoon sunlight had shifted to a warm golden hue by the time they finally moved from the immediate emotional intensity of the reunion to the quieter work of filling in the gaps. Dorothy had shown them all the letters, reading portions aloud in a voice that trembled with emotion as she shared James O'Connor's words of love for their mother. Robert and Charles listened with expressions that shifted between grief for a love story cut tragically short and wonder at discovering this hidden chapter of their mother's life. "I need to show you something," Charles said suddenly, reaching into the leather messenger bag he had brought with him. He pulled out a small wooden box, weathered and simple compared to Dorothy's ornate rosewood one. "After Mother died, we were going through her things. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: jewelry, important documents, photographs of us and our families. But I found this hidden in the back of her closet, wrapped in a silk scarf." He opened the box carefully, and Margaret leaned forward to see its contents. Inside was a small collection of items that seemed random at first glance: a pressed flower, fragile and brown with age, a ticket stub from a movie theater dated 1951, a military insignia button, and a tiny pair of knitted baby booties, yellowed with time but clearly handmade with meticulous care. Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She kept something of mine," she whispered. "She kept baby clothes she made for me." "There's more," Robert said quietly. He reached into his own bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I found this in her desk after she passed. It's not a diary exactly, there are no dates, no regular entries. Just scattered thoughts written over the years. Some pages are from the 1950s, others from decades later. I never understood what they meant until now." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read, his voice thick with emotion. "I wonder if she has my eyes or his smile. I wonder if she laughs easily or if she's serious like her father. I wonder if Catherine tells her stories about brave soldiers and true love, or if she grows up thinking such things are fairy tales. I wonder if she'll ever forgive me for choosing safety over courage, for giving her away to give her a chance I couldn't provide. I wonder if she knows, somewhere deep in her soul, that her first mother loved her more than anything in the world, loved her enough to let her go." The silence that followed was profound. Dorothy sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, staring at the journal as if it held the secrets of the universe. Margaret felt her own throat close with emotion, watching her grandmother finally receive the answer to a question she had carried for 10 years, had Sarah Montgomery thought about her? Had she loved her? "She wrote about me," Dorothy finally managed to say. "All those years, she thought about me. She loved me." Charles nodded, wiping at his own eyes. "There are dozens of entries like that scattered throughout the journal. Some are just a sentence or two, others are longer reflections. She never used your name because she didn't know what name Catherine had given you. She just called you, my first daughter or my Rose, after what she had planned to name you." "May I?" Dorothy asked, reaching for the journal with shaking hands. Robert placed it gently in her lap, and she began to page through it slowly, reading her birth mother's private thoughts about the child she had given away. Margaret watched her grandmother's face transform as she read, the pain and longing of 73 years of not knowing gradually being replaced by something else. Understanding. Healing. Peace. "There's something I need to tell you both," Dorothy said after a long while, closing the journal carefully. "Something about your father, William Thornton. Did he know about me?" Robert and Charles exchanged glances. "We've been wondering the same thing," Charles admitted. "We talked about it on the drive here. Our father died 20 years ago, and toward the end, when he knew he was dying, he told me something strange. He said, 'Your mother was the bravest woman I ever knew, and she carried more pain than anyone should have to bear. If you ever learn something that changes how you understand our family, remember that she did everything out of love.' At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental because of the illness," Charles continued. "But now I wonder if he knew. If she told him about you before they married, or maybe even after." Dorothy considered this, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "If he knew, then he married her anyway. He married her knowing she had given birth to another man's child, knowing she had loved someone else. That takes a kind of courage too." "They weren't unhappy," Robert said thoughtfully. "Our childhood was stable, loving even. But you're right, Mother always seemed to carry sadness. Father was patient with it, gentle. He never pushed her to be something she wasn't. Maybe that was because he understood what she had been through." Margaret, who had been mostly silent during these exchanges, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about something. Dorothy, you said the lawyer who brought you the box came after Sarah died. Did he explain how she wanted you to be found?" Dorothy nodded. "He said she had left instructions with her attorney that upon her death, they were to locate me using whatever information they could piece together from her private papers. She had kept a record of Catherine's last known address from 1951, my birth certificate, everything she had. The lawyer hired an investigator, and they tracked me down through public records and Catherine's death certificate. So she planned it," Charles said slowly. "She planned for you to know the truth after she was gone. She wanted you to have the letters, to understand why she did what she did." "But why wait until after her death?" Margaret asked. "Why not reach out while she was still alive?" Robert looked at his sister with an expression of deep sadness and understanding. "Because she was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid that Dorothy wouldn't want to know her. Afraid that revealing the truth would hurt us, her sons. Afraid of disrupting the life Dorothy had built. So she chose to give Dorothy the choice, to seek out her biological family if she wanted to, but only after Sarah herself was beyond being hurt or rejected." Dorothy clutched the journal to her chest, fresh tears falling. "I would have wanted to know her. If she had reached out, I would have wanted to meet her, to thank her for giving me life and for loving me enough to give me a chance at a better future than she could provide at 17. She didn't know that," Charles said gently. "She couldn't know that. All she knew was the guilt she carried and the fear that she had done an unforgivable thing." They sat together in a circle of shared grief for lost opportunities, for a reunion that could have happened but didn't, for a mother and daughter who had loved each other without ever knowing each other. But gradually, as the afternoon wore on, the grief began to transform into something else, gratitude for the connection they had now, for the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, for understanding replacing mystery. "I want to show you something," Dorothy said, reaching back into her purse. She pulled out a photograph that Margaret had never seen before. It showed Dorothy as a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, holding a baby, Margaret's mother. "This is your niece," she told her brothers. "My daughter, Catherine. I named her after the woman who raised me, but now I see I gave her one of your mother's names too. Sarah Catherine Montgomery married William Thornton, but I named my daughter Catherine. It's as if I somehow knew." Robert took the photograph carefully, studying it with Charles looking over his shoulder. "She has the family eyes too," Robert said softly. "And Dorothy, "You look so much like our mother in this picture. It's uncanny." "We're family," Charles said, and the simple statement carried the weight of revelation and acceptance. "We lost 73 years, but we're family now. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward." Dorothy reached out, taking each of her brother's hands in hers, the three of them forming a circle that had been broken before they were born but was finally, miraculously, being made whole. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary October day when Dorothy had met her brothers for the first time. The winter had come and gone, and now spring was painting the world in fresh greens and delicate blossoms. Margaret stood in her grandmother's new apartment, a larger, brighter space in a senior living community that Dorothy had moved to in March, one that felt less institutional and more like a real home. The walls were covered with photographs now, a visual timeline of a family coming together. There was the original photograph of Rose and James from 1951, professionally restored and framed. Beside it hung a new family portrait taken just last month, Dorothy seated in the center with Robert on one side and Charles on the other, all three of them smiling with the kind of joy that comes from having found something precious you thought was lost forever. But it was the collection on the opposite wall that made Margaret's heart swell every time she saw it. Photographs of family gatherings that had taken place over these past 6 months, Thanksgiving at Robert's house in Boston, where Dorothy had met her brothers' families for the first time, Christmas at Charles's home, where his grandchildren had delighted in discovering they had a great-aunt they'd never known about, Easter dinner just last month, where 3 generations of a fractured family had come together to celebrate both the holiday and their improbable reunion. Today was special for a different reason. Dorothy had invited everyone to her apartment for what she was calling a ceremony of remembrance. Margaret had helped her grandmother prepare, setting up chairs in the living room, arranging flowers, laying out the photographs and letters and journals that told the story of Sarah Montgomery and James O'Connor's love. Robert and Charles arrived first, bringing their wives, Patricia and Elena, women who had embraced Dorothy with the same warmth their husbands had shown. Then came Robert's 3 children with their families, and Charles's 2 daughters. The apartment filled with voices and laughter, with the particular chaos that comes when multiple generations gather in one space. Dorothy stood in the center of it all, radiant in a pale blue dress, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. At 74, she seemed somehow younger than she had 6 months ago, as if the weight of not knowing had aged her more than time itself ever could. When everyone had settled, Dorothy moved to stand beside a small table where she had arranged the rosewood box, Sarah's journal, and a new addition, a photograph of James O'Connor in his military uniform that Robert had managed to obtain from the National Archives. Beside these items sat something else, a framed letter that none of them had seen before. "Thank you all for coming," Dorothy began, her voice steady despite the emotion Margaret could see shimmering in her eyes. "6 months ago, I didn't know most of you existed. I had lived my entire life as an only child, believing I knew my history, my origins, my place in the world. And then Margaret found a box in a drawer, and everything I thought I knew turned out to be incomplete." She paused, looking around the room at faces that shared her features, the distinctive eyes, the shape of the chin, the way certain people tilted their heads when they listened. "I could be angry about the secrets, about the years we lost. I could rage against the circumstances that separated us, against the social pressures that forced a young woman to give up her child, against the war that took my father before he could know I existed. But I've learned something in these months of getting to know all of you: anger is a weight that does nothing but hold us down." Charles's younger daughter, a college student named Sophie, wiped at her eyes. She had become particularly close to Dorothy, visiting her twice a week to hear stories about the past and to share her own dreams for the future. "Instead of anger, I choose gratitude," Dorothy continued. "Gratitude for Catherine and John Sullivan, who raised me with love and gave me a beautiful life. Gratitude for my daughter Catherine, who isn't here with us but whose memory I carry every day. Gratitude for Margaret, who could have closed that drawer and forgotten what she found, but instead had the courage to ask questions and seek answers." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as her grandmother smiled at her with such love and pride that it hurt to hold it all in her heart. Gratitude for Robert and Charles, who could have turned away from an impossible truth but instead opened their arms and their families to a sister they'd never known. And gratitude for Sarah Montgomery and James O'Connor, whose love created me, even if they couldn't raise me together. Dorothy picked up the framed letter, holding it so everyone could see. This arrived last week. It's from Sarah's sister, your great-aunt Eleanor, who is 92 years old and living in a nursing home in Connecticut. Robert and Charles didn't even know she was still alive. She hadn't been in contact with the family in decades. Robert leaned forward, his expression stunned. Aunt Eleanor. We thought she died years ago. She's very much alive, Dorothy said with a soft smile. And when she read about our reunion in the letter Charles sent to extended family members, she wrote to me. Would you like me to read what she said? Everyone nodded, the room falling into complete silence. Dorothy adjusted her glasses and began to read. Dear Dorothy, though I will always think of you as Rose, the name my sister whispered to you in the only 3 days she had with you. I am Sarah's younger sister, and I was there the day you were born. I was only 14, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. I remember holding you, this perfect tiny miracle, and I remember the way Sarah looked at you with such fierce love and such devastating sadness, knowing she would have to give you up. I want you to know that giving you to Catherine wasn't abandonment, it was salvation. Our father would have sent Sarah away to have the baby in secret, would have had you adopted by strangers, would have erased any trace of your existence. But Sarah fought him. She demanded that Catherine be the one to take you, insisted that you stay in the family even if no one could know the truth. It was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Sarah loved you every day of her life. She never forgot you. When she married William, she told him the truth, and he loved her anyway. He was a good man who understood that hearts can hold multiple truths at once. Sarah loved William and gave him 2 wonderful sons, but she also loved James O'Connor and grieved for the life you 3 could have had together. I stopped speaking to the family 40 years ago because I couldn't bear the pretense anymore, couldn't keep living the lie that you didn't exist. But I want you to know, Rose, Dorothy, that you were always loved. Always wanted. Always remembered. And I am so grateful that you found your brothers, that you're finally getting the family you deserved all along. With love from your Aunt Eleanor. By the time Dorothy finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. She set the letter down carefully and looked at her assembled family. So you see, even the secrets were acts of love. Imperfect, painful, complicated love, but love nonetheless. Robert stood and went to his sister, embracing her tightly. We're going to visit Aunt Eleanor next week. All of us. She should meet the family she's been cut off from for so long. She should meet the niece she held as a baby, Charles added, joining the embrace. As Margaret watched her grandmother surrounded by her brothers and their families, watched the way they touched her arm and held her hand and looked at her with acceptance and affection, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The secrets that had divided them had finally brought them together. The pain of the past had transformed into the healing of the present. Dorothy had spent 73 years not knowing who she truly was. But now, in this room full of laughter and tears and the particular warmth that comes from family finally whole, she knew. She was Rose Elizabeth Montgomery, daughter of Sarah and James, whose love had been impossible but real. She was Dorothy Sullivan, raised with devotion by parents who gave her everything they had. She was a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. And she was a sister, finally, wonderfully, completely a sister. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be honored. The lost years couldn't be recovered, but the remaining ones could be filled with connection and love. And sometimes, the most important thing a family can do is refuse to let secrets have the final word, to choose truth and openness and the messy, beautiful work of healing together. Margaret's decision to open that drawer and pursue the truth changed everything for her grandmother and an entire family that didn't know it was incomplete. But it also raises profound questions for all of us. How many secrets lie hidden in our own families, waiting to be discovered? How many lives have been shaped by choices made decades ago out of fear, shame, or a misguided desire to protect? And if you found a box of letters that revealed your entire history was built on a beautiful lie, would you have the courage to seek the truth, knowing it might shatter everything you believed about yourself? Dorothy lived 73 years not knowing who she truly was, carrying the weight of unanswered questions about her identity and origins. But when the truth finally emerged, it didn't destroy her, it set her free. She discovered that she was loved in ways she never imagined, by people she never knew existed. Sometimes the most painful revelations become the greatest gifts. Sometimes the secrets we're most afraid to uncover are exactly what we need to finally understand who we are and where we belong. And sometimes, family finds its way back together across impossible distances, simply because someone is brave enough to ask the questions no one else dared to ask. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Margaret's place. Would you have opened that drawer? Would you have pursued the truth? Your thoughts matter to us, and we can't wait to hear from you.